Hey everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to uncover a hidden story that's happening on, well, all of our dinner plates. It's a story about energy, about who eats whom, and about this invisible, unwanted ingredient that somehow climbs its way to the very, very top. So, what's really going on in the food we eat? Let's dive in. So before you take your next bite of food, have you ever just stopped to think about its journey? I don't just mean from the store or the farm, I mean the journey of its energy. See, every single meal connects us to this huge invisible network. So what is the real story behind your dinner? Let's find out. Okay, so to really get that story, we've got to start with the absolute basics, the planet's menu. It all comes down to who eats whom, a process that seems simple, but actually powers every single living thing on Earth. The easiest way to picture this is with a food chain. It's just a straight, linear path showing how energy moves from one organism to the next. Think about it. Grass gets eaten by a rabbit, and that rabbit is then eaten by a hawk. It's one clean, straight line. But trust me, it's just the beginning of a much bigger, messier story. So check this out. We've got two perfect examples right here. Over on the left, in a forest, you see energy flowing from the plants to the deer, and then from the deer to the tiger. On the right, in a grassland, it's moving from grass to a grasshopper to a frog, and then up the chain. And the main thing to get here, the big takeaway, is that energy only flows one way. It never, ever goes backward. But of course, nature is rarely that simple, right? I mean, a tiger doesn't only eat deer, and a frog doesn't only eat grasshoppers, and that's where this idea of a food web comes into play. It's a much, much more accurate picture of what's really happening out there. Okay, this looks a whole lot more like the real world, right? A food web shows us that most critters don't just eat one thing. An owl might snack on a mouse, but it could also go for a snake or a little bird. Now, this web of connections is what makes an ecosystem really strong. But, and this is a big but we're about to get into, it also creates all these different pathways for problems to spread. Things like pesticides can sneak into this web from all over the place and travel in really complex ways. So, as all this energy is moving through these chains and these webs, how much of it actually gets passed on? Well, nature's got this super strict rule for that, and I like to think of it as a kind of energy tax. 10%. That's it. That's the magic number to remember. Only about 10% of the energy an organism gets from its food is actually passed on to the next level. So if only 10% moves on, what in the world happens to the other 90%? Well, that other 90%, that's the tax we were talking about. It's basically the cost of doing business for a living thing. Organisms use up all that energy just to live, to move around, breathe, keep themselves warm, and make more of themselves. It's essentially lost as heat, so it's just not available for whoever eats them next. And this diagram really ties it all together beautifully. Energy flows one way, starting from the sun, going to the producers, the plants, and then moving on up the chain. At each and every step, what scientists call a trophic level, a huge amount of that energy is just lost. This massive energy drop-off at each step is exactly why most food chains are pretty short. There's just not enough fuel to support a ton of levels. All right, so we get it. Energy gets burned up. But here's where the story takes a really interesting turn. What if something gets into the food chain that doesn't get used up? What if there's this unwanted ingredient that gets passed along with that little 10% of energy? And this is the key. This is the whole point. While all that energy is being spent and disappearing, certain substances aren't. They don't get burned off as part of that 90% energy tax. They just stick around. They build up. So you're probably asking, where are these things even coming from? A lot of the time, they're man-made things like pesticides we spray on crops, or even heavy metals like mercury from factories. Think about it. They get washed by the rain into rivers, lakes, and oceans. And once they're there, they get absorbed by the organisms at the very, very bottom of the food chain, like algae and plants. And boom, that's their entry point into our food. Okay, so how does a tiny, tiny amount of a chemical turn into a massive problem? Well, it does it by climbing the food chain, getting more and more concentrated at every single step. And this process has a pretty cool name, biological magnification. Okay, here's the textbook definition for you. Biological magnification is the process where these non-degradable chemicals become progressively more concentrated at each trophic level. The two big words to lock onto here are non-degradable, meaning they don't break down, and more concentrated, let's actually walk through how this happens. It's pretty wild. So imagine a little plant absorbs just one single unit of a nasty chemical. Now, a primary consumer, like a rabbit, might eat 100 of those plants over its lifetime. It now has 100 units of that chemical stored in its body. Then a higher-up consumer, maybe a fox, comes along and eats 10 of those rabbits. You see where this is going? The fox now has 1,000 units of that toxin concentrated inside it. It gets magnified at every single step. So we've talked about how energy fades and how toxins build up. This brings us to the big final question. What does all this mean for the organism at the very top of a lot of these food chains? What does it mean for us? And this quote, man, it just hits the nail on the head. As humans, we are often sitting right at the tippy top of multiple food chains. We eat the big fish that eat the smaller fish. We eat the livestock that eat the plants. And what that means is that the absolute maximum concentration of these persistent chemicals can end up accumulating in our own bodies. That right there is the ultimate result of biological magnification. It's a really powerful idea when you think about it, isn't it? The food sitting on our plate is the final chapter in a long, long story of energy transfer and sometimes chemical accumulation. So I'm just going to leave you with this one question to chew on. Knowing that you're at the top of the food chain, how does it change the way you see your plate?